Welcome from Kansas City. I'm Peter Riddle, the U.S. editor of the Financial Times newspaper based in Washington. Education reform is now high on the American agenda, as can be testified by 50 governors and the President himself from their recent summit in Charlottesville. One person who I'm sure would love to have been there was Robert Maynard Hutchins, one of the great controversial figures of U.S. education for much of this century. He was actively involved from his early 20s, Dean of Yale Law School at 28 and President of Chicago University at the extraordinary young age of 30, a post he occupied for 20 tumultuous years. He believed in challenging the established thoughts and beliefs of the U.S. higher educational system, primarily with his advocacy of a broad-based liberal education, and particularly his suggestions of great books, which should be the common heritage of everyone who was going to university. His life is in a sense best summed up by the title of his recently published biography, Unseasonable Truths, written by a former friend of Mr. Hutchins, Harry Ashmore, himself a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist from his days in Little Rock during the 1950s in the early days of the civil rights movement. Mr. Buckley, during your early days of fighting the liberal causes, wasn't Mr. Hutchins, in a sense, one of the opponents you were trying to attack in your early book, God and Man at Yale?
Well, Mr. Hutchins was, for us conservatives, a very complicated figure. He politically learned to decide with the liberals on almost all matters, a very sharp departure from his isolationism in the late 30s and early 40s. And of course, he was viewed as sort of an instrument of the left wing of the Ford Foundation, concerning which Mr. Ashmore will have a great deal to say. But he was a person of such extraordinary interest, given his enormous skills, that I think it would be a good idea, if it's okay with you, to show some of the pictures from your book that show him in a series of positions that will help viewers who sort of are hazy about him to situate him historically.
Yes, I think so. Of course, your career began, I suppose, in the sense, well, a little bit later than Hutchins. You're a little bit younger. But your first book, God and Man at Yale, was essentially taking issue with most of the positions that Hutchins was already taking at that time. And you have continued throughout your career, I think, to become an intellectual spokesman for a point of view, conservative it's called, although I'm not sure conservative and liberal have much more.
Indirectly. Here's a historical piece of trivium that you don't know but might amuse you. I was the editor of the Yale Daily News when James Roland Angell died. Yes. James Roland Angell was president of Yale, who made him the secretary when he was 30 years old. So I called him at Chicago and asked him to comment on the death of his former patron. And he said, well, I can only tell you the thing that was said by the man who asked the architect of St. Paul's what he thought about him. If you want to see his monument, just look around you.
He was talking about the Gothic buildings at Yale.
That's right.
He once said that Angell had learned all that he knew about architecture and destruction at the University of Chicago, where he was. He'd put up Gothic buildings there, and then he went to Yale and tore down everything in New Haven and rebuilt it in stone.
And as we will see, tore down a lot of other things. But let's have those pictures, shall we?
Well, that is a picture, of course, of the book. This is Hutchins at the time that he graduated from Yale, I believe. That's his yearbook picture. He was in the split class. He came there after the war. He'd been in service in World War I. This is a picture of his arrival in Chicago with his wife, Maud. He was just arriving to take over the University of Chicago at the age of 30.
I'm surprised we were holding hands.
Well, it lasted for a while after that.
Oh, that's it.
Well, I don't know. There are other pictures, but I don't see them.
Oh,
Oh, here they are. This is a picture of the Round Table of the Air, which originated on the campus at Chicago. That's John McCloy in the picture with Hutchins. That, I think, was the first network talk show on the air. It was radio, of course. This picture was taken before World War II. And Hutchins, of course, in a sense, launched that, I would say, if that is the first, he launched, these early predecessors of shows like this. I'm not sure he would have kept you on the air, but at least it's that kind of show. This picture shows him with Paul Hoffman, who was the chairman of the president of the Ford Foundation, and William Benton, who owned the Encyclopedia Britannica. They were very close to Hutchins for many years. This picture shows him with Justice William O. Douglas, who was a fellow law professor of his at Yale, and they continued to be very close friends. And Douglas became the chairman of the board of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, which was Hutchins' last creation. Here's Hutchins with an old friend of yours, Henry Kissinger. This picture was taken at a Pacham and Terrace convocation, where we had, I think, about all the points of view on questions of war and peace, including that of Mr. Kissinger. He was then Secretary of State. And this is somebody with a slightly different view. That's George McGovern, who was also there. And with him is the second Mrs. Hutchins, Vesta Hutchins. And we're back again to the commencement picture. That was when he left Yale in 1921.
Well, let me ask you, Mr. Ashmore, the question that this program is called, did he leave any footprints? We know that he led a fascinating life, but we also know that he went to Chicago with a mission. That mission was not, in the judgment of most academic historians, consummated. But it is true that a great many people feel now that some of the insights of Mr. Hutchins, in fact, are beginning to catch fire now, but then there's a subdivision over whether he was an elitist or whether he was not elitist. But tell us what it is that caused all the excitement when he went to Chicago. What did he seek to do for higher education?
I think that he was, from the outset, he was challenging the intellectual and the academic establishment. And what Hutchins had in mind was basically a reform in higher education that extended also, before he was through, to the whole of the educational structure, including the public schools. And if you go back and read the speeches he was making 50 years ago, everything that's on the agenda today, he was talking about then. Mm-hmm. The terrible condition of the public schools, the dropout rate, the fact that the public schools were inadequately training teachers, so they had badly trained teachers who were turning out badly trained students. The failure of the university, his great charge against the university was one that I think basically you shared. He was the advocate of the core curriculum, of trying to have for the undergraduates, the college level, a similar core, and he wanted it based, not necessarily entirely, but he thought a basis of it could be the great books of the Western world. This was to train every student, as he said, before they got into specialized training. And he always made a distinction between training and learning. He thought the college should be an entirely intellectual enterprise. Training, specialization should come later.
Yeah, but am I correct in saying that, like Mortimer Adler, he felt that all students in America should be learning the identical thing, and the student who could drink from a fuller glass would simply get more, but he would be getting the same thing.
Yes, the charge of him.
The distinction between that position and that of Alan Bloom, I'd like to hear your comment on that, is that Alan Bloom felt that before you reached age 16, 17, or 18, really the distinction becomes palpable between those who can absorb more of the kind of learning that Mr. Hutchins was talking about and those who simply could be trained, the Albert J. Nock position traditionally.
Yes, well, I think that is a distinction, and Bloom, I accused him of being elitist. I don't particularly like the word. I think it does fit in this case. Hutchins was the reverse of that. He and Adler, of course, he said he got his ideas for the great books from Adler. Hutchins took the position that the distinction in American education that set it apart from that on the older universities on the continent was that we had no ruling class here, And the problem was to educate every citizen to perform effectively in a democratic society. So the slogan that he used, and Adler is still using on his Padilla proposal, is that the best education for any is the best education for all. And Hutchins said it was an article of his faith that any child above the level of moron could be educated. And he felt that the burden of educating children who came from diverse backgrounds, particularly those who came from an inferior background, rested upon the educators. I was struck to hear one of the things he said after he had achieved separate status for the college at Chicago. He never got the great books curriculum in, but he did have a core curriculum. He had a separate faculty, which he was always trying to get. And having achieved this, he then challenged the faculty there, and he said, all right, we've now demonstrated that we can effectively educate high school valedictorians. Now we've got to find out how to educate everybody else.
Yeah.
And this was always, I don't think he was perfectly consistent in this. I think Bloom departs from that in very important ways. Bloom is more concerned by becoming a guardian of philosophy, the philosophical virtues, than Hutchins was. Hutchins never professed to be a philosopher. He was ideas that came in part from Adler. The structural ideas for refiguring the university's setup really came from William Rainey Harper, who was the first president of the University of Chicago and who attempted to make the divorcement that Hutchins made. They wanted to combine the last 2 years of high school with the first 2 years of college and make that strictly liberal arts training, learning, not training. No specialization. That would come later. Those who were going on to teach, who were going into research, who were going to be practitioners, would then at the second level...
Head for an MA, then.
That's right.
Yeah.
So that was a distinction that he got from Harper. He brought that idea over. He never fully put it into effect at Chicago. He did for a while, and the other aspect of the experimental aspect, which I always thought very highly of, was that admission would be on the basis of examination. Promotion and graduation would be on the basis of examination conducted by outside examiners. So people could proceed at whatever rate they wanted to. You could get through in 2 years or 4. You could enter at almost any age if you could demonstrate that you had the capacity to take the level of education that was available in the college.
How do you account for the fact that his successor as president of Chicago said if he had stayed another term, he would have ruined that much of the university that he hadn't already ruined? Was that a reaction to sort of a temperamental difficulty that one had in getting along?
I found it a perfectly extraordinary statement. I quoted it in length in the book. It was made. I didn't have the chance to interview Mr. Kempton. He was dead. But I found nobody at the university, including his worst critics, who agreed with that statement. As a matter of fact, Hutchins was a perfectly extraordinary administrator, and most people agree with that, even though they had ideological differences with him. He raised an enormous amount of money while he was there, and he did that in the Depression. He got there in 1929, and the stock market crashed about the day he was inaugurated. He had to cut the budget by 30% because of reduction in income from endowment. And he said a very interesting thing, which you would approve of, I'm sure. At the end of this period, when they had to curtail the faculty, they did it by putting in a mandatory 65-year-old retirement age. And he reported to the trustees that we could have reduced the faculty by 10% with a happy heart if we'd been able to select the 10% to take out. He was constantly inveighing against the cluttered condition of the curriculum, all the specialized studies, and the fact that and he was constantly at war with his faculty on the question of where the final responsibility lay for the ultimate good of the university. He said, and I think he's right, I think it's still true, that there was no way to fix accountability in the academic structure. The president was caught between a board of trustees who could overrule him, a faculty that could overrule him, and if he was trying to make any changes, as he once said, any change in our education in this country has been made over the dead bodies of thousands of professors.
Well, I know that very, very few people have any sense of the limit of the powers of the university president. I remember lunching a year or so ago with the new president of Yale, and I said, what powers do you actually have? He said, I have exactly the following powers. I can appoint the deans. That's
right.
all I can do. Well, it seems to me that if you can appoint deans for long enough, you can pretty well dominate the vector of academic thought. But that takes an awfully long time.
Well,
Those deans got to outlive an awful lot of contemporaries, don't they?
The first great fight that Hutchins got into with his faculty at Chicago predated the curriculum question and the great books. First of all, it was reorganizing the structure of the university to reduce the power of the faculty senate and also to reduce the power of the department heads.
Yeah.
He always said about William Rainey Harper that he inherited all of his good ideas from William Rainey Harper and all of his administrative problems. Because Harper, who'd started the University of Chicago from scratch, in order to attract the fine scholars that he brought out there, he gave them all kinds of powers. He made every department head practically autonomous. The deans had no authority at all. So Hutchins got there. He had 70 departmental budgets that came to him directly from the chairman of the department. So he managed to make a reorganization that put that power in the hands of 6 deans who were answerable to him. They had to consolidate all these budgets that came from the department heads. To reduce the power of the department heads, and he finally managed to reduce the power of the Senate, which is made up of all the tenured professors. It didn't even include the associate professors, some of whom had tenure, but just the senior men. And they had absolute veto power. When he finally broke that power by reorganizing the Senate and to broaden the base, including more people, those were fights that took on within the terms of efficient administration, and he paid a great deal of attention to this. He spoke frequently about the problems of administration. He said the problems, well, I'm sure he was echoing the president of Yale, who would agree with him, I'm sure. He said the problem with a university president, among other things, that he has at least 4 constituencies. He has his trustees, he has his faculty, he has his students, and he has the public. And he said he could usefully spend most of his time with any one of them. What he does is divide his time between all 4, and so all of them are unhappy all the time. And he kept saying the problem is time, that there's not enough time. So he was seen by the students in his days at Chicago as a very remote figure. And
well, there's also a sense in which I think he contributed to that, if you like, myth of his remoteness, because when he went out Santa Barbara to head up that institution, which you ended up by heading after he departed, there was a sense we got from its publications and much of its activity that he was really alienated from the American experience. He wanted to rewrite the whole Constitution. He wanted to, he got Rex Tugwell in there to do that in 37 or 8 drafts, and then he wanted a world order and so on and so forth. So there was a feeling there of detachment that we got, which after all Henry Ford also got when he eased him out of the Ford Foundation.
I suppose so, but of course there was always an effort. You led the troops in the effort for a while, the period right after World War II, to brand Hutchins as some kind of un-American. And it seems to me it was never very successful because he was really a classic type of a New England Calvinist. And of course he was concerned with these larger questions. But he also was very real. He never expected to write a new Constitution. He thought the Constitution needed to be brought into accord with the institutions and processes that had been vastly changed by demographic, technological communications revolution that we've been through.
Well, wasn't he perfectly content to let the Supreme Court do that, which it does anyway?
No, he's very critical of the Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, he would have agreed with you. He always said, well, we don't need a new Constitution because the Supreme Court's rewriting it all the time anyway.
But he was a legal realist.
Well, he was a reformed legal realist. He attempted to put legal realism in at Yale. That was his great reform there in the brief time that he was dean. But he later, in there, what he was trying to do was introduce economics and the social sciences into the law curriculum.
Yeah.
And he actually proposed an institute which would combine aspects of the medical school and the law school with all of these psychologists, the social sciences which were quite new. He became very disillusioned with the social sciences. He found that they had gone wrong, in his view, because they were attempting to apply the principles of pure science, the absolute virtues of the scientific method, to human affairs which didn't fit. Hutchins thought that there were certain values that came out of the Western tradition that should govern the curriculum of the college. He always was a great defender of academic freedom, and you were always a great critic of academic freedom. As a matter of fact, the difference that I found between the two in the one head-to-head encounter when you published two pieces on education parallel in the Newsday on Long Island. That was the principal difference between you. You agreed that there should be a core curriculum. I think you agreed with him that it should be rest on the values that we learned from the Western experience, from the Greek forward.
Well, yeah, I believe that academic freedom was being abused as a vehicle for a kind of solipsistic immunity to individual teachers that divorced them from any idea of a mission of the university. I don't see how you can have graduate teachers without total academic freedom. But to say that this frees a college from any sense of subscription to a body of ideas is to me nihilistic. And since he was not a nihilist, I was always rather surprised at the lengths to which he carried his devotion to academic.
Well,
academic freedom, after all, tells you that all ideas are equal. That is to say, all ideas should start equal in the race, to quote the Columbia Teachers College God on the subject. And Robert Hutchins was too bright to think any such thing. He obviously thought that his ideas were superior to certain other ideas, and should start out with a head start.
You must remember that his great adversary in those years was John Dewey,
Sure.
who was the spokesman that you're just talking about. And
Yeah.
many sins were committed in his name, too, including many of those in progressive education.
And in a sense, John Stuart Mill.
That's right. But Dewey was the uncritical defender of the scientific method. That was all. And I think that they went astray in part in the debate with Hutchins because he accused Hutchins of being a scholastic. He thought somehow this old Calvinist Presbyterian had been seduced by
Aquinas.
By Aquinas. And Hutchins, of course, always said he identified himself as a Platonic Aristotelian, an Aristotelian Platonic Platonist, either one you wanted to have. What he was really doing was trying to establish to his own satisfaction by rational means a kind of natural law that would follow Aristotle's as Aquinas had defined it, without God. Whereas Aristotle, of course, in the classic Catholic tradition, put God in, as you did. So this was one of the differences. You spoke about the acknowledged truths that should be in the curriculum, and you talk about certitudes. Hutchins would talk only about values. Now, he called himself a metaphysician, and I think that he was. He used that word, and it also created a lot of controversy because that was a word that sort of carried over with the notion of scholasticism.
Sure, and the very notion of metaphysics presupposes the existence of certitudes, i.e. truths that exist beyond your power to measure, and confutes the scientific, the presumptions of the scientific method.
It presumes that philosophy, of course, is the highest order of, and it presumes first principles and that kind of thing. This he certainly followed. Well, Hutchins was a moralist, and he was an activist, and he also, like you, was an ironist, and that caused him a lot of trouble too, because any time that you speak in iron, and he had a sense of the absurd that was very strong and irrepressible, really. And I think he was frequently misunderstood as a result of that.
Well, since you only have a few minutes, let me ask you this. Your book is fascinating at two levels. One as a biography of a fascinating human being. The other as an essay on the thought of a fascinating human being. To what extent do you think that the ideas of Robert Hutchins prescinded from his life are interesting enough to engage the attention of curious Americans?
Well, I think he represented a couple of things. It seems to me he represented an older tradition in America, which was that of the abolitionist, of the Calvinist New Englander, the moralist, who also was a man of pragmatic temperament. He was, I referred to him, I was satisfied with it entirely, as a worldly Puritan. He didn't have any of the limited kind of views of ordinary morality, sin, and that kind of thing. He always said that, speaking of his effort to create a natural law without God, he said that he recognized that probably human beings would not be able to live up to the ideal of the Aristotelian ethic. because they were rational animals, and that meant that they not only could be rational, but they were also animals. And so he thought there was such a thing in the human condition as what a theologian would call original sin. He recognized that. He was never a utopian in the sense that he thought there was any method by which men could be lifted up, be born again, or have a Freudian. Of course, he was very anti-Freud, very critical of Freud, very critical of Marx. And in that sense, he was at odds with most of the New York intellectual coterie of his day, including many of his peers. He was never deluded by any notion that Marx had any kind of answer,
Yeah.
or Freud.
Yeah. But so you think that just his thought itself is interesting enough to serve as his monument?
I think so. I think that, and I tried to, the reason for all the lengthy quotations in the book was attempting to have him present in his own words, which were better than any I could provide with him, what he was really about.
You have just 15 seconds.
And it seems to me that what he was trying to do was preserve the maximum amount of individualism in this country, while also creating a form of government which took care of the common good. And this has been the historic conflict. It was, in a sense, the conflict between you and Hutchins all those years.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ashmore.
Thank you.
Funding for Firing Line is made possible by the financial support of viewers like you and by Payne Weber and the Friends of Firing Line.